audiences to which poets get to present, everything from boutiques to galleries to banks, IT parks, public gardens, schools, colleges, and unfortunately, in this year when everything has been restricted in terms of public gatherings, the festival couldn't happen at its usual time in December, but instead Prakriti decided that they would take the festival online this year. So Prakriti Festival now comes to you on your screen, your computer, your cell phone, your tablet, however you want to watch it. We're mindful of video conferencing fatigue since so many of us are spending so much time online. So this is not a very long event. We'll keep it to under an hour. We will have a conversation. I mean, Arundhathi will be reading her poems and Ranjit will be in conversation with her, and Ranjit will also be taking questions from the audience and choosing from them to present them to Arundhathi. Ranjit and Arundhathi are both dear friends and people who I personally have not just personal fondness, but also debt to them for poetry. And so I'm very glad to be able to introduce both of them. Ranjit did a reading in December and a wonderful conversation with Arshia Sattar, which should be up on Prakriti's channel soon enough. Ranjit is a poet, a translator, a cultural theorist, and a curator based in Bombay. He has 7 collections of poetry out, most recently the Atlas of Lost Beliefs. Arundhathi, our guest poet for today, is an award-winning author of 12 books of poetry and prose. She's been widely translated and anthologized, and her most recent volume of poems, Love Without a Story, was published in 2019. And it's just out internationally as well. In India, it's Westland Amazon, internationally Blood Axe Books, which has been described as a breathtaking and heartwarming book, and a unique poet of our times in a league all by herself. Her previous book, When God is a Traveler, was the season choice of the Poetry Book Society, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Arundhathi is the recipient of various awards and fellowships, including the inaugural Khushwant Singh Prize, the Raza Award for Poetry, the Zee Women's Award for Literature, the Il Ceppo Prize in Italy, the Zee Indian Women Award for Literature, the Mystic Kalinga Award, among others. She's written extensively on culture and spirituality and has worked over the years as a poetry editor, cultural curator, and critic. As a prose writer, her books include the best-selling biography of contemporary mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life. As editor, her most recent book is the Penguin Anthology of Sacred Poetry, Eating God. I will now ask Dr. Venkatraman to welcome our poet and moderator to the session, and briefly remind all of you, we will be taking questions after the reading. You can feel free to chat with one another in the chat box and comment in that chat section. But questions for the poet must be typed only in the Q&A box. We'll only be looking at the Q&A box for the questions there. Please keep your questions brief and, if possible, connected directly to the poems being read. Of course, questions about craft and are always welcome, because I know there will be poets in the audience as well, aspiring poets who are coming here to learn from folks like Arundhathi and Ranjit. We will try to take all questions that come up, but that may not be possible, and we apologize in advance if that's so. Over now to Dr. Venkatraman.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening. On behalf of the Department of English, University of Madras, I welcome you all to this session. Poetry with Prakriti has always been inimitable eye-openers, rather soul openers, I would say. Thank you, Prakriti. Atmanam, a Tamil poet, in his poem called Alivu, begins his poem thus: Ennai alithalum en eluttai alikka iyaladu. En eluttai alithalum adan sabdathai alikka iyaladu. Translated, it would read, Even if I am destroyed, my words cannot be destroyed. Even if my words are destroyed, its sounds cannot be destroyed. These opening lines speak for the invincibility of the works of art of great writers. And Prakriti has never failed in bringing to us such creators of caliber. Thank you once again, Prakriti, for continuing these Herculean endeavors. Now, I extend a special welcome to one such creative artist who, to quote her own words, enjoys hanging around words. Friends, I take immense pleasure in welcoming Arundhathi Subramaniam, a poet, translator, arts critic, anthologist, performing arts curator, and poetry editor. I also take pleasure in welcoming Mr. Ranjit Hoskote, a renowned poet and a Sahitya Academy Award winner, and an art critic, cultural theorist, and an independent curator. Listening to poetry is always such an unique and irreplaceable journey. Sundara Ramasamy, in his Tamil poem, En Eluthu, after describing the poetic process, ends with these lines. Ennai alikka yarundu, எழுத்தில் வாழ்பவன் அன்றோ நான். In English, it would read, can anyone destroy me? Am I not one who lives in words? Once again, I welcome Arundhathi Subramaniam, who, like many, lives in words. I recollect reading her description. Poetry is a kind of kinetic energy, and that poems breathe differently on the page. Let us now experience how words and sounds come together to create that experience, which only a gifted few can give us. Over to Arundhathi Subramaniam and Ranjit Hoskote. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Venkatramanan. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Prakriti, for making this happen. I know that there have been some wonderful readings these past few months, and there are many ahead that are going to be very exciting. I'm particularly pleased to be here in conversation with Ranjit, with whom I go back a very long way, decades actually. And I'm looking forward to a conversation, but the format that we thought we'd follow is that I would read for about the first 8 to 10 minutes, after which we move into a conversation for a while. I then resume the reading, and then we follow up again with a conversation. So it will be about 10 minutes of poetry followed by conversation each time round. And then, of course, comes the difficult question, which is the poem to start with, which is always the troublesome moment in any reading. But I'm going to read primarily from my new book, Love Without a Story. And because I happen to be in conversation with Ranjit, who also grew up as I did in the same maddening city, a city that we, I think, have deeply ambivalent feelings about, and at the same time can't help returning to. At least that's certainly true in my case. I'd like to start with a poem that acknowledges the literary ecosystem that in some way sustained us very deeply, particularly as young poets. And I know I share this with Ranjit, as I do with Peter, and with perhaps some others who are listening in. This is the very first poem in the book, and it has an epigraph from the Bombay poet Eunice D'Souza, who says, "Best to meet in poems." As I often say, I don't know how many of you have admired the work of a poet and then made the mistake of actually meeting her or him. It can be an anticlimax from which it takes a very long time to recover. I grew up in an age of poets. I grew up in an age of poets who would have me believe that joy was for cabbages, until I found that beneath their smoking empires of sulfur, there lay a shiver of doubt, that they wondered, as I did, about what it might mean to be leafy, to wilt, to be damaged sometimes by upstart caterpillars, but still stay green, chaotically, wetly, powerfully, green. Now, I meet poets who exchange visiting cards, are best friends with the dentist, all dankness deodorized. Their poems cool seashells, their laughter splintered eggshells. Poets who never seem to wonder about cabbages at all. Still best to meet in poems. And with that, I'm going to move into some of what I consider to be the poems in this book that perhaps I don't read as often as I'd like. As the very title of this book suggests, it's called Love Without a Story, which is actually a line from one of the poems that I hope to read at some point. But as the title suggests, these are poems about intimacy, love, conversation, but not a gooey, sentimental love, as much as a love that is made possible when one allows the gaze to widen, when one allows the gaze to include. And it is that sense of kinship across the very frozen, hardened stances and divides that have taken over our world. It's those moments of kinship that interest me. So I find the poems returning time and again to that preoccupation in this book. And I'm going to start, there are different definitions of love in this book. There are monks and mystics who offer their definitions. There are also parents and lovers and friends and conversations with all kinds of wonderful, unlikely people, but people with whom those conversations proved to be personally very enriching. This particular poem is called Ninda Stuti. And I choose to read it because, as some of you might know, I've had a long-standing fascination with bhakti poetry, the whole tradition of devotional, sacred poetry from the subcontinent. And what's always fascinated me about it is this particular strand that allows you to rage at the divine, to hurl cuss words at the divine if you want, and still never fall out of love with her or him, or them, or it. The fact that it is possible to have this kind of deep intimacy, which in fact allows for any tone to be used in a conversation with the divine, that you might actually throw a tantrum and consider it to be a poem of praise. That's Ninda Stuti. Ninda, of course, as most of you know, means complaint, and Stuti is a song of praise. And this has an epigraph by Hafiz, the Sufi poet, who says, complaint is only possible when living in the suburbs of God. I loved the line. And since my own relationship with the divine is very definitely not a downtown one, I felt it was an apposite way to begin. Ninda Stuti. We are not impressed by your platoons of admirers, your raging eyes, your guest lists, your visiting cards, your 7-horse chariots, your LED screens. We aren't minor either. If it's about choosing between big and small, form and vacancy, we choose neither. If you're playing the game, we are too. We come from a tribe that knows that a versified tantrum is a kind of prayer. We turn invective into love, salty, sometimes sulfuric, and love into obscenity. Our longing reaches for the stars. Domesticated by our fury, even the skies turn terrestrial. And the rest of the time, the earth, this lunatic suburb, is plenty. And with that, I'm tempted actually to move to another love poem, but the kind of love poem that interests me particularly in this book, and which interests me in a lot of the legacy of bhakti poetry, where you can't quite tell the difference between the romantic poem and the sacred poem. There is a kind of blurring there, which interests me, and which is, I think, an integral part of this poem too. It's called Let Me Be Adjective. It's one of those poems I haven't read from this book, at least in a very long while. And of course, it's about being the kind of adjective that I trust, the salty kind. Let me be adjective. And so the verb is all, but I'm not ready for it yet. I tie knots every now and then to dam the flow, to pretend I'm thing, I am thing, and to pretend you are too, more thing than I, worthier of being described. And until the knots come undone, as one day they must, let me modify, qualify, anoint, counterpoint, apostrophize, parenthesize, invent, dissent. Let me take wing, let me sing. You. I suppose I'm asking, like the old bards did, to be your garland. Not always tenderly floral, just a little tart, a little contrary, the kind that isn't always allowed within walled gardens. But even as I meander, let my trail be the thread that completes the circle that I long to make around you, love. Let me be adjective. And I'm going to move from that to a poem of friendship, a poem of loss, a poem that I'm choosing to read actually now. It strikes me because Ranjit actually knows some of the cast of characters implicated here. But of course, like every poem, this is a fictionalized reality. And yet there are convergences that I know that he will recognize. I don't want to say anything about this poem other than the fact that I think it's for all those who've known at some point the great heated conversations in college cafeterias where there's always the sense of perennial sunlight. I don't know how many of you have known that kind of image. Perhaps some of you have. Deleting the picture for AA 1967 to 2015. It's 2005, and we're almost glamorous, the five of us. The chairs are cane, my shirt batik, the sunshine Goa, and Heineken. We're past the clumsy brutality of 18. We've deleted makeshift faces, borrowed persuasions, stances without journeys. We've forgiven the treacheries of student seminars, wrong addresses at different ends of the city, digressions of faith. No edge to our voices anymore when we say Zen or Gramsci. We're wearing the dumb happy of holiday and wearing it well. And there's always so much sun. Against lime-washed churches and casual plantations of melted green, we are laughing hard. Beer glazed, sand drizzled, stoned on Sergeant Pepper and Kishore Kumar. And there's the other picture, look, where arms entwined, we are bathed in fierce siesta light, and we seem to know that this moment is teetering on the verge of never again. It isn't difficult, of course, to fast forward the embarrassment of memory, to speak as others do of calcium rather than satori. So the morning I heard, it wasn't difficult to turn efficient, to delete pictures of hummingbirds and cardamom tea, and the air ticket you emailed me, never knowing it would be the one to your funeral. It gets easier, friend, with age, to delete, to plan breakfast, to turn the page. It would have been easier still if you hadn't deleted the sun. And I think I'm going to move from there to a goddess poem before I actually pause and allow Ranjit to come in as well. I'm looking forward to that conversation. But I've actually spent a good deal in the past decade, a good deal of my time in South India. And something about the South that's always excited me is just the abundance of goddess temples. And I've had my own personal goddess temple with which I feel a very deep connection. And I have a couple of poems to that particular goddess here. But the one I'm going to read to you here is about a different goddess. She is a goddess who inhabits a particularly modest abode somewhere in the foothills of the Veliyangiri Mountains. She is largely unknown except to her local following. She is tended to by this small, very gaunt tribal priest. And she is a goddess who has fascinated me, and it felt like it was time to do my bit for her and to write her the kind of tribute that she deserved. This is the goddess Neeli Mariamman. Goddess. Those who go to the great temples of Perur and Avinashi know nothing of her. She isn't interested in being the flavor of a few thousand years. She's been around since the planet was a seizure of waterness and protoplasm. In the great garrulity of gods, she is silent. She'll never be the life of the party, but she isn't concerned with the party. She is life, twisty, blue, nerve, fire, life local, life perennial, the goddess Neeli Mariamman. On Tuesday afternoons in the month of May, she erupts into an epilepsy of form, ballooning a small nut-brown priest into prescience. And as he foams and curdles, his eyes sightless, she prescribes remedies to a peasant plagued by blisters in his gum. She advises the old crone to be patient with her daughter-in-law, for fear must not spawn a new generation. And then she turns towards you, and her eyes are craters, her light molten jaggery and burnt almond. Her tongue is toxic shock, her gaze tundra. She is the shockingly naked wire at the center of the world, where your future is a long burnt out morning star. The universe is her hamlet, she says, a fly stain in her monarchy. Her laughter is her empire. Thank you. I think I'm going to pause here and move into a conversation, and perhaps triggered by that conversation will be some other poems, and I can return to reading again. But for now, I just want to say thank you for listening, and hello, Ranjit.
Hi, Arun. It's marvelous to be in conversation with you. And I want to thank Prakriti and Peter, Harish, Dr. Venkatramanan for creating this occasion for us to speak. Not that we don't normally. It's one of the great blessings, I think, for our generation that we have these long friendships to look back on and which sustain us. We've known each other now and been friends for more than 3 decades. And it's been a marvelous journey for those of us who came together around St. Xavier's and Elphinstone College in the late 1980s, around the Malhar Festival, around Poetry Circle, to have continued these journeys together and to have compared notes, to have followed each other's work. So I want to really thank you for this first movement of this evening, which is deeply, deeply moving. Also the poem dedicated to Anant, which brought back so much of the thrum and the tenor of that early period. But I want to focus on 2 motifs. One was your recurrent motif of a circle that calls to be closed and yet continues to be in motion. And this amazing line from the poem you just read, Goddess, the universe is her hamlet. So I thought what I'd do as my first sort of question is to draw you out on the different kinds of communities of which you've been a part. In one sense, they're concentric. There's the community of the Bombay poets around the Poetry Circle, which was an early staging point for both of us and for some of our friends. There's also the larger community of poets of which you've become a part through your marvelous work as an editor and an anthologist, whether it was for the Poetry International Web, the India domain, or through the anthologies you've edited over the years, whether it's the Sahityaka Academy post-colonial poetry anthology, Another Country, A Pilgrim's India, Eating God. So there's all of that. And then there's the community of belief of which you're a contributor. And then there's the series of collaborations you've had with people involved in dance in your role as a dance critic. So how do these different conversations and collaborations come together for you, and how do they sustain your poetry? The early friendships, the collegialities across languages, the work with dancers, and the community of belief.
What a wonderful question. And it's going to take me forever to answer it, Ranjit. I'm going to have to find a way to approach it. Let me just say something about where we started, which is growing up in the city. I called it a maddening city earlier, and it remains one. And yet it is the city to which I return, though there was a time when I felt the need for a long reprieve from it. And I think there was the sense growing up with a great love of language and the kind of deep discontent that poets are supposed to feel, or, you know, well, one felt one ought to be a poet because one felt the discontent, one wasn't sure which came first. But I think what the Poetry Circle offered at that time in my life is the sense that this was a shared passion, a shared preoccupation, a shared lunacy. And this adda in the southern part of the city that we all gravitated to once every fortnight, perhaps oftener at times, became in many ways central because it felt like this was in a sense a cultural or literary satsang.
Right.
But there was a sense of real conversations around this source of this literary form that we were all just infatuated by. And what I particularly value from that period, looking back, Ranjit, I'd say is the emphasis on form, on rigor, the fact that so many of our conversations were around the form and shape of a poem and not just about content, and the endless ideological battles that one can spend a lifetime on, forgetting what the whole business of poetry is really about. So I'm very grateful for that. I think it was formative in many ways. And through that whole period was also the fact that you and I and many of our friends also had this deep connection with other art forms. In your case, it was the visual arts. For me, I had grown up with dance, and there had always been an abiding awe at performers and the energy of a performance space. And I've been deeply connected with theater as well. So I've always felt a great fascination with the performing arts because of the sense of heightened aliveness that they are able to distill. And that's something that I aspire to, even in the written word or even in the spoken word. So I suppose that these conversations with artists particularly in the performing arts, but others too, dancers, musicians, and theater people, I suppose, looking back, that these conversations were nourishing my own understanding of poetry in some way without my quite being aware of it. At that time, these felt like very discrete parts, but all of them were linked by one single fact, and that was the fact that I enjoyed myself. It was a source of great pleasure. But it was later in my life, Ranjit, when I felt that my own life in some way had been, there was a moment of what I call disruption, for want of a better word, when all the more academic excitements around philosophy, for instance, and spiritual literature was suddenly inadequate. And I felt in this moment of disruption that I desperately needed a living spiritual path of my own. And when that began to unfold, I made other discoveries. This was not a path that unfolded easily. There were moments of great doubt and of great fear, and I'm not sure those have gone away entirely. But what did happen in that process was the discovery of another kind of literary ancestry. And that for me became many of the poems that I had actually grown up with, because many of these bhakti poems that we talk of are actually performed in the Bharatanatyam dance repertoire. They're an integral part of it. But I had breezily moved by them until the moment of disruption happened, and they became for me a source of deep sustenance, anchor, sanctuary, provocation, many of the things that I required to feel rescued at that time. And so I began to turn to them differently. So if I were to look to my antecedents now in literary terms, I'd say it's certainly the poets that I grew up with, the poets that we all read at the Poetry Circle together, the many poets whom I was excited to discover for myself when I was editing the Poetry International Web India domain, the sense of being, the excitement of it, and also the joy of being able to usher into the English language poets who had otherwise been relatively unknown in that domain. So that was exciting. I've been nourished by all of that, but a very deep reclaimed ancestry has been the Bhakti poets. And I think I discovered them for myself differently. I rediscovered them, was resuscitated by them. And so there is a particular allegiance I feel there, which I don't think I can talk about enough. I don't know, does that answer the question? It's a lovely motif, circles. And I do know that the circle returns in many of the poems in this book.
Yes, it does. No, it's a beautiful answer. I was also struck by the way you put this about the two, if not more, genealogies, because I've had exactly the same feeling. And it's true of our generation, I think, that we were brought up and we encountered a certain kind of poetry that came typically from outside, whether it was through what we studied or whether it came through the modern poetry and translation series or through the people we encountered. But there was another ancestry that revealed itself only gradually through the life of the home, through scripture, through folklore. In a way, it's a very Ramanujan kind of motif, but it played out very differently for us. And I think translation was extremely important. For you, the Tamil saints, for me, Laldied, for Jerry now, the Marathi women saint poets, and for many of us in this generation, for Tabish Khair, Kabir. And that's something I want to maybe dwell on a little bit in your work too. Although you haven't necessarily put out a book of translation, translation is an extremely important dimension of your work, I find. And I'm just compelled to think about these things, particularly when I think about your book, When God is the Traveler, for instance. Particularly the title poem, where Kartikeya Subramaniam becomes your alter ego, your Ishtadevata in some sense, and is the figure of someone who travels around the world to discover themselves. So so thank you for talking about how you revisited and rediscovered this other literary ancestry through going back to dance, to the poems you've known in a different sense. But what were the dialogues like that you had with the contributors that you brought into, for instance, the Poetry International web domain? And also the path-breaking work done in Eating God, where you commissioned new translations, as for instance, Mustansir Dalvi's Rahim work. As an engine of translation, Eating God didn't just work with reprints or existing work, it also brought new translation work into being. So could you talk a little bit about your commitment to this dimension of translation as such, and as it informs your own work, your own poetry?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think Eating God became a particular kind of a catalyst in a way that I wasn't aware of at the time. It proved to be that in some ways.
I should hold that up too.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have the book, I don't think, with me, but yes, it is a book where I felt the need. It started with very real felt needs. I felt the need to have a conversation with Rahul Soni, for instance, and ask him whether he would be inclined to translate Mirabai afresh. I wanted to hear a Mirabai who wasn't just lyrical and prettified as she often is. I wanted the darker underbelly of Mirabai to come through, particularly in this poem that I had heard of, where she speaks of this bird that she then sends into, she says, she sends the bird and she says, fever bird, I'll tear off your wings and I'll rub salt in your beak if you don't listen to me. This is a new, ferocious Mirabai. And I wanted that sound as well to be an integral part of this, of this book. And he responded to that with a kind of excitement and enthusiasm that was wonderful. And I think that may actually have catalyzed a long-term project for him. Likewise with Mustansir's translations of Rahim, I wanted the reminder of all these voices that remind us of a certain kind of syncretic inheritance that we seem to be doing our best to demolish. And Rahim is one of them, with his lyrical paeans to Krishna. There's also Saleh Bega, the Oriya poet, whom
Prabhanjan Mishra.
Yes, part Muslim, part Hindu, who also has his beautiful translations to Lord Jagannath, who's been translated here by Prabhanjan Mishra. And so journeys began, I think, with that book. Conversations began. And discoveries began, which I think are still underway, which feels very good. But to come back to this broader question of translation, Ranjit, I think each time round it has arisen from a deeply felt need. It hasn't come as a kind of politically correct project at any point. It's not because I ought to be doing a translation, but when I was working on Eating God, for instance, compiling these poems, I knew I wanted to hear poems in praise of the divine feminine. So it became a need then personally to go and translate some of the Abhirami Antadi by Abhirami Bhattar, who is the 18th and 19th century poet priest of the temple of Abhirami in Tirukadeyur in Tamil Nadu. So I have a bunch of my own translations of Abhirami Antadi. Epigraphs from there enter the new work. So there's a way in which one seems to leak into the other. And if there's anything that I've found happening, and maybe this is a function of age, maybe this is just a function of, if I were to offer myself a more complimentary explanation, I'd say perhaps a more focused spiritual practice has had something to do with it too. Realizing that these very diverse or discrete pursuits in my life, areas of curiosity, are actually much more connected than I had ever imagined, much more deeply connected. So there are people who perhaps know one as, and I know you and I have had this conversation often, that there are people who know one as, in your case, as an art critic, and there are those who know one as a poet, or there are those who know one, in my case, as the biographer of Sadhguru. There are different roles, but in my own experience, these are all very deeply and integrally linked. This is one person for whom these connections, for whom all these connections are vital. So I think if there's anything that the spiritual journey has made possible, to answer your question on translation, it is the realization that I can't live in a closet anymore, that all these rooms are connected. And the only way sometimes to smuggle the radiance of one room into the other, to bring in the sunlight into the other, is by an act of translation. That's the only way to do it. So that's how translation, I think, has happened.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely marvelous. I respond very warmly to your idea of the increasingly integrated consciousness, because I think perhaps we've moved as a generation from having very strong stances as young people to also reclaiming those parts of what we inherited as legitimate cultural and psychological contents in a productive way, not in the way of revanchism in any sense. So thank you for that. But I think it's time, Arundhathi, for you to read another set of poems, and then we can return to the conversation, especially because so many of these thoughts have now come up in what we've talked about. maybe this turn towards a more amplified and ambivalent sense of love, the connection between, what is Shringar, the connection between the erotic and the sacred, because these richly inform your most recent book. So if you could read us a few poems from Love Without a Story, and then maybe we move towards what the audience has to say to you.
I think I'm tempted, because you actually mentioned the Kartikeya poem, When God is a Traveler. Because you mentioned that, I'm actually tempted to point out that Kartikeya returns in this book, in the new book. And I had never anticipated his return, but he does. And he returns this time with an insight that for me was important, because in When God is a Traveler, my previous book, he is the traveler around the world, looking for meaning everywhere and returning in some way to find that his answers are to be found exactly where he is. And how could it be otherwise when your parentage is Shiva and Shakti and so on? But of course, it was a very deeply personal poem too.
Yes.
In this particular book, I grew fascinated by a woman who is known to actually everyone in Tamil Nadu, an extraordinary woman, a wise woman, a poet, a traveler, a crone, a really woman. And I think you'll find the word crone returning more than once in this book. I think there is a fascination as I grow older, I think, with the wisdom that might be represented by age. And the thing about Abayar, this woman, this extraordinary woman, part legend, part history, we really don't know where one ends and the other begins. What excites me about her is the fact that we are told that she voluntarily chose old age. And in an age obsessed by youth and beauty, that kind of decision does leave one thinking. So I started with that. What does it mean to make this choice? And that led me to the Abayar story itself, because there's a particular moment in her life when she encounters this little boy on a tree who asks her, "What fruit would you like, Granny? Do you want the hot fruit or the lukewarm one, the not so hot one?" And this little boy turns out to be Kartikeya, Lord Muruga, all over again. So he returned yet again in a way that I haven't. But my Abayar in this cycle of poems is a woman with a past, and a woman who hasn't chosen to deny that past, but she has in some way chosen to, she's realized that the whole story doesn't have a single point, that there are multiple points, and sometimes it's absolutely enough to do no more than to be a traveler, to enjoy campfires every now and then, share a fruit and some laughter, and move on. So this is Abayar, and I'd like to read just one or two poems from this longer cycle. This is an Abayar who decides against the entire litany of ingredients on skin creams: collagen, spirulina, vitamin A, vitamin E, macadamia nuts, extracts of green tea, triclosan, selenium, propylene glycol, alpha hydroxy acids, bergamot, retinol. She's interested in none of it. Abayar makes another choice. Fearless friend to gods, ally of peasants, counselor to kings, traveler of the darkest streets. She walks the world alone. And on such a path, she says, it's best to be a crone. For lovers, flatten into photographs, photographs into reminiscence, reminiscence into quiet. And then what's left? Perhaps just the oldest thing in the world, love without a story. So what's it going to be, Gran? A hot fruit or a lukewarm one? Asks the little boy on the tree, left cheek bulging with jamun and laughter. Pure cheek, really. Abayar sighs, knows the tiresome games of the young, trick questions, riddles, puns, crosswords, wisecracks, limericks, mormos, anagrams, knows that little boys grow into men that scintillate, men that pontificate, men that dribble curses, men that cannot apologize, gray-faced men, men that turn love to ash, men with shiny weapons and kettle drum agitations, men with epic stories, epic vanities, epic bibliographies, epic, men that make young girls giggle and silently plot vengeance. Vedantin men, men with restless gazes, men that sip white wine and drip malarme. Abayar sighs. The thing about age is seeing through the game, but still being able to smile at those who play it. All right, she says. All right, boy, make it lukewarm. I'm tempted actually to read a little more of Abayar, but one part of me is inclined, Ranjit, at this point to just go to a fun poem. Because
this was a fun poem too, in its own way.
And it's going to return to some more fun. Should I read the last section of Abayar?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. For me, this is actually a section I haven't read. And I think it's time to read it because in many ways for me, this distills what I believe Abayar's life choice might have implied. I don't think Abayar turned young again. She didn't need to. But she threw off her last disguise, wise woman, keeper of the faith, and settled down to becoming what she'd always been, a traveler with an appetite for conversation, a boy God's best friend, composer of one-line poems, epics whitened by a blizzard of silence. And she learned to forgive men with puzzled eyes who invite you to share nothing more against life's Bukhara winters than the campfire of the heart. And she finds another way to walk the razor's edge between lush Shola grasslands, stunned by a blue fusillade of Kurinji flowers, and urban jungles moistly evergreen with people on the make. She learns to trust only the wisdom that sings, learns the crumble and the equipoise of crumble, not looking for a point, knowing that the point, if any, is a shared fruit and laughter, knowing that there's no happily or sadly ever after. And she finds a new credo for mendicants, a new paradigm. Stay molten-tongued, never lukewarm, even if ragged in rhyme, unhurried, forever out of step, always on time. That for me is, I often say, my aspiration, unhurried, forever out of step, always on time. That's the person I'd like to be. And with that, I'm going to move to the fun poem that I promised, which is, but I'm going to return to Abayar after that. This is just my need periodically to turn rage into an anthem, which is a strategy that matters more and more to me and is one that I hope to adopt more of. It's called Song for Catabolic Women, and it's for women, all women of a certain age who are constantly being reminded of metabolisms that are decelerating, and it's meant for all of them. Song for Catabolic Women. We are bound for the ocean and the largesse of sky. We are not looking for the truth or living a lie. We are coming apart, we are going downhill, the fury is almost done. We've had our fill. We are passionate, ironic, angelic, demonic, clairvoyant, rational, wildly Indian, anti-national. We are not trying to make our peace, not itching for a fight. We don't need your shade and we don't need your light. We know charisma isn't contagious and most rules are egregious. We are catabolic women. We've known the refuge of human arms, the comfort of bathroom floors. We've stormed out of rooms, we've thrown open the doors. We figured the tricks to turn rage into celebration. We know why the oldest god dances at every cremation. We've kissed in the rose garden, we've been the belles of the ball. We've hidden under bed covers and we've stood tall. We are not interested in camouflage or self-revelation, not looking for a bargain or an invitation. We are capable of stillness, even as we gallivant, capable of wisdom Even as we rant, look into our eyes, you'll see we're almost through. We can be kind, but we're not really thinking of you. We're losing EQ and IQ, forgetting to say please and thank you. We're catabolic women. We've never ticked the right boxes, never filled out the form. Our dharma is tepid, our politics lukewarm. We'd had enough of earnestness and indignation, but we still keep the faith in conversation. We are wily Easterners enough to argue nirvana and bhakti, talk yin and yang, Shiva and Shakti. When we are denied a visa, we fall back on astral travel. And when samsara gets intense, we simply unravel. We are unbuilding now, unperpetuating, unfortifying, disintegrating. We are caterwauling, catastrophic, shambolic, cataclysmic, catabolic women. And I'm moving from that to the last poem of this particular reading, and it's the afterword, the end of this particular book. And as long as there are wizened men sipping ochre tea in a shop with the aluminium roof down the road, and the clerk with the absurdly radiant smile in the post office, behind the municipal school, near the Mariamman temple, it may not be so difficult, Aveyar thinks, even if friends seem far away or distracted, to decant quietly into some dawn, leaving behind a smudge, then perhaps nothing at all. Some days she suspects the plot is thicker, the weave richer, the fiber finer, the story more outrageous, the longing more contagious than she once supposed. Some days she suspects all tales unravel, all fibers fray, all threads unspool into an exuberance of yarn. Some days she suspects she might even ride a Persian carpet to the stars.
Thank you so much, Arun. That's really, really beautiful. Yes, all threads unspool into an exuberance of yarn. That's the kind of line where Aga Shahid Ali would have said to us, you need to say wah wah and not just sit quietly and marvel. So that was from this marvelous book. And Arun, I'm going to, in the time that we have, I'm just going to turn over to the questions we have. We have one question for you. Meena Mall, who asks, you talked about your discovery and return to the literary ancestry where you established roots. How far do you think that your readers find that kind of belonging in your art?
Well, that's an interesting question. How much do you feel readers find that kind of belonging in your heart? As an art reader?
In your art.
In your art. Does one address readers as well? Is that an important part? Is that what she means?
If I might just intervene there, I think the question may have something to do with response. I don't want to say reception history, but how do readers follow you on that journey? There's an interior logic to it, but how far is that accessible necessarily to readers?
Mm-hmm. So I think, thank you, Meena, for that question. The one thing I often say is that when I was very anxious about being understood, which was, through most of my growing years, you want in some way to communicate, to connect, to be understood. But the more anxious and more tense I was about being understood, I actually traveled further away from myself than I wanted to. And the paradox is that when I exhaled and allowed myself to inhabit myself more deeply and fully, with all my idiosyncrasies, and there are many, and with all my quirky preoccupations, and the Bhakti poets are one of them, I actually found that it was possible to connect with many more people, because with many more readers, certainly, because essentially, when one is talking about bhakti or the spiritual in any way, as I often point out, one is not talking about a category unto itself, some little cubby hole that is to be opened every now and then. But it's actually, as I said to Ranjit earlier, it's been about plummeting initially into through some trapdoor into a part of the self that seemed almost alarming, but then gradually finding that there are many more connections here than one had ever supposed. So the spiritual is really not about writing about a particular subject as much as it is really about how you write about it, who you are, and therefore how you write about it, how you breathe and how that might inform your work. I've actually found that if anything, as a spiritual practice became more important in my life, I felt that the poems were becoming more porous, less anxious about being understood, more open to surprise. And in some ways, I felt that the fact that they were actually inhabiting the page differently and that my own voice was, the timbre of my own voice shifted in some way, I actually believe that there were many more connections I made and many more readers I found. So I think rather than grow very tense and anxious about these things, as some of us do at times in our lives, it's also good to give oneself permission to become oneself and to deepen that journey. For me, the creative journey and the spiritual journey are just deeply, deeply and umbilically connected.
Arun, there are 3 more questions, and I'm going to just put them to you. One from Hema Morley, one from Kamini Dandapani, and one from Peter Griffin. So let me start with Hema's question. I was really intrigued by your reading of Avayar, because as you read, there was the sense of wandering, a steady meandering. I apologize for the Western reference, but it reminded me of Virginia Woolf. Would you say her style was an influence? Did you ever feel the same sense of wandering when you read the works of ancient poets?
Well, certainly Woolf was important to me at a point in my life, very important to me, Hema. So I don't mind the Western reference at all, because I think I grew up with a wonderful, happy mix, a jumble, like most of us do, of all kinds of references. And, you know, I'm very grateful for all those writers, many of them dead white and male, even, not necessarily female like Woolf. So I'm grateful for all of that. But about whether Woolf is an obvious influence, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I see it really, but what I do see is this preoccupation. You talk of the meandering, and I think there is one aspect of poetry that is deeply associative, which I trust much more. That's one part of it. The other is one's own life. I think this has happened to many of us. We've discovered ourselves as actual geographical travelers in one way or the other. And that links to more primal notions of travel, which have also preoccupied me, certainly. The idea of quest, the sense very often in some of the earlier work of being displaced, of cultural or spiritual dislocation, or if you want to use a word of even greater gravitas, of exile. Though I don't want to use that word lightly. But I think that sense of existential unease has been a part of a lot of the earlier work. I think the travel remains, but some of that unease, from what I can see in the new book and the one before this, When God is a Traveler, I feel that that unease has abated somewhat. And there seems to be a greater sense of how to navigate diverse worlds and enjoy them and celebrate them, but while trying to retain a certain equipoise. And the thing about equipoise, as I often say, the bad news about equipoise is that it's not a static condition. Once you get there, you can't stay there. You have to keep working at it.
I think a related question would be from Kamini Dandapani, which that was brilliant. Thank you. Have you been inspired by any male bhakti poets?
Oh, several, Kamini, several. I think Nammalvar, and particularly the translations, A.K. Ramanujan's translations of Nammalvar and Hymns for the Drowning. That book actually felt like a hand that reached out and pulled me out when I felt sometimes the waters were really beginning to engulf me. So I have felt rescued by that book. So Nammalvar certainly, of course, A.K. Ramanujan's translations of many of the Veerashaiva poets as well, and particularly his, not just Allama Prabhu and Devarada Samaya, Basavarna, and Tukaram. You know, just reading Chitre's translations of Tukaram initially, but just growing very fascinated by that voice and the just the diversity of tones that poetry is capable of. So I think all these poets who sounded hoarse and broken at some point and weren't afraid to share that, and still remind us that there is a way, that the way beyond is the way through, that the two are not separate. Yeah, these and many others, Kamini.
Peter's question has to do with your other writing, Arundhathi. He asks whether your writing on dance and your other writing has influenced your poetry.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Peter. I often say that some of my conversations with dancers have been amongst the most illuminating, personally. It's helped me understand my own poetry in many ways. And I find I did learn dance and I did some amount of yoga as well. And that's been an integral part of my life. So perhaps it's not entirely surprising that sometimes the metaphors that matter to me, even in my poetry, come from dance. So I would often, for instance, look for the spine of a poem. I often talk of poise in a poem, as I did just a little while ago. But it's not a decorative poise that interests me. I'm interested in the kind of poise that is not a tense poise, but a natural poise, what we would call a sahaj quality in the poise. That interests me. Much of these, I mean, these are images that a dancer would understand right away, because that's what they are often looking for in their work too. And the other aspect of my own poetry, which I think comes from dance, is the sense of enjoying the sense of language on terra firma, not shying away, however spiritual, you know, people often think writing the spiritual somehow means turning into some puff of vapor. And if anything, what I enjoy is the sensuousness and the grain of an idea. That excites me. But equally, I'm excited about the sense that a lyric poem often gives me, even when reading it, you know, reading someone else's poetry often, the sense of just, this is language that seems to ache to leap off a page. So that dance, in a way, between gravity and grace, that excites me in poetry and in dance. So these images are very deeply connected. And perhaps not surprisingly, the terrestrial, the aerial, spine, poise, all these matter to me.
I'm going to jump out of sequence here because Anju Makhija's question really seems to pick up on what you just said. And Anju asks, and she says, you spoke of disruption and celebration. Does the relationship between the two reflect in your work?
Hi, Anju. It's good to hear from you. And it's wonderful to be reminded again of another much earlier conversation at the Poetry Circle. And thank you for coming. And thanks for your question. Disruption, definitely, Anju. I think there's a poem of mine called Confession, which I think sort of confronts it head on. It took me many books to write a poem called Confession because I was so uncomfortable with the idea of what was called confessional poetry, or at least in terms of the associations it had begun to inspire in people's minds. So Confession really talks about the sense, and there's an image in that poem that sums up what I call my moment of disruption. It says, when I opened the coffee percolator, the roof flies off. That was the sense, really, a sense of dark elation, which was how I experienced a deepening spiritual journey at a point in my life. So that feeling of dark elation, that sense of a kind of bewildered joy and bewilderment together, that sense, that's also there in many of the poems, which I actually found paradoxically at that time turning very sensuous. So a lot of the poems became very erotic around that time. And there's a poem called Black Estrus that you might remember from an early book. It's from When God is a Traveler, but it's also in the New and Selected Where I Live. And that's yet another poem of this kind where there is, I wish I could get those last lines of that poem, but it would probably sum it up. It talks of this feeling of anticipation of something enormous and the sense of simultaneous fear and fascination. I think that's there too. So yes, I do believe it leaks into the work.
But I'm not sure I'm ready for it yet. Yeah. That shock in your daily kabuki of shape and event. Not yet, not yet, that shock of vacancy.
So that shock of vacancy, I'm not sure I'm ready for it yet.
So here's a question. Sorry, Arun, were you about to say something?
I mean, fascinated as I am, to go back to what I was saying to Kamini earlier, fascinated as I am by the Sagun poets, Tukaram does it magnificently in his, almost blurs the boundaries between the God with name and form and the God and the formless divine. There is a blurring that happens there. And fascinated as I am by the Sagun poets, and I often write about them because I feel they're often given short shrift. There is a deep terror and awe and fascination with the formless divine too. I think anyone who wants to allow their own personal journeys to intensify has to confront that at some point or the other.
Which is why I'm sometimes surprised at how the Nirguni tradition of bhajans, for instance, seems to play such a strong role in the cultural lives of people whose politics otherwise are set rigidly against the sacred. That's amused me no end quite often. But it also speaks of how there's something in the Nirgun that transcends these binaries of stance and belief and ideology.
Yes. Yeah. At least it seems to point to something that I think people apprehend as significant. Yeah. But I love the Sagun, bhaktas. I love their fascination with the concrete and the singular. My Neeli Mariamman for me was in a small way a tribute to that intense sense of the local.
Absolutely, yeah.
That Shiva is not just the great god of Mount Kailash and not just this formless divine, but this very deity down my street. He belongs not just to Kailash, but to the Kaveri Delta right here. That sense of the local, the concrete, also I find deeply endearing. And I also know just how desperately one needs the sense of that concreteness, even while attempting to move beyond.
Yeah, it's what Kumaraswamy talks about in his famous essay on folklore, the Margi and the Desi, the great abstract transcendental divinities so are across the subcontinent, and the deeply rooted, robust, powerfully vernacular divinities, and how sometimes the many overwhelm the one. It's not the one subjugating the many. I think that comes across very, very strongly in what you just said.
Yes, and I think for me it was an important realization that there is really no contradiction between the two.
Absolutely, yeah. Which leads us to, I think, what might be the last two questions of this session. I think we're at 8:13. Ashwini B, who asks, how do you locate Bhakti poetry traditions in the technological era where people are more rational? I think it's optimistic to think we're more rational today, but that's Ashwini's question.
It's a lovely question, Ashwini, but I'm not sure I know how to answer it. I'd say, what has the technological era made clear to us? For one thing, it's made clear that we may not be able to have the kind of embodied interactions that we had earlier, at least we haven't been able to for a while, but that we need that sense of intimacy more than ever. And I don't think, and I'm actually very grateful for Zoom, because it has made intimate conversations possible. And it's made it possible for me, with my husband who lives overseas, and it's been made possible with friends all over the world and with relatives. So I'm grateful for it. And at the same time, I'm fully aware that there are limitations to that intimacy. And I think some of the sensuousness of just daily embodied interaction is not possible. The Bhakti poets, if I were to say, the cornerstone of Bhakti poetry is intimacy. So that is the link really between the two. And the Bhakti poets remind us that you can, by having this kind of deeply intimate relationship with the divine, you have the permission to speak to the divine in any way you choose. That allows you to curse him or her, to love him or her, to dispense with him or her. And there is a freedom and a love, therefore, that go together. And if technology begins to open something up in that direction, where freedom, spaciousness, and intimacy are not seen as mutually exclusive, I think there would be more convergences than we might imagine.
And the last question I think of this evening goes to, or comes from, Ruta Dharmadhikari. It's hi Arundhathi, great to listen to you as always. My question, can you share with us what kind of readership you have acquired over the years? Who reads you most, do you know?
Hello, Ruta. It's lovely to hear you again, a voice from the distant past. It's good to hear you, and I hope you're well. Who reads me? I don't know, Ruta. I think that the prose is read by a particular kind of person. There is much of my prose has been around. There is the biography of Sadhguru. There is the work that I co-authored with him on Adi Yogi. There is a book on the Buddha. There is a book of essays around pilgrimages, sacred journeys. Ranjit has also contributed an essay to that. There's a more recent work around women on the spiritual journey that I'm interested in. I think there is a particular kind of person who might be drawn to that. And there is, poetry is often seen as a kind of niche, something that is meant for a niche audience. But what interests me now more and more is this happens, I think, thanks to perhaps literary festivals have had something to do with it. But the fact is that the live poetry reading has a way of connecting with people, even those who have decided that poetry is not for them, which many people do quite unfortunately. Many people somewhere around their 20s stop poetry entirely. And I found that it's not just me, but many other fellow poets have found ways to connect with readers through live readings. And that is the power of the spoken word too, and of the kind of aliveness that it brings, which prose, or which is largely meant for the written, for the printed page, cannot quite accomplish.
And now the absolutely last question from an anonymous attendee. In brief, do you have a sense of what or where next for your work?
With every book of poems, I'm quite convinced it's the last one. And I mean this very truly. I may have a few stray poems that have been written after Love Without a Story. I do, and some of them have been published as part of lockdown anthologies. But honestly, I don't quite know if there will be another book of poems. That's how it's always been. And that's absolutely true, and it's an honest answer as far as the poetry goes. As far as the prose goes, when there is a need to listen in to more voices, women's voices, for instance, in sacred poetry, I'd like to listen to more of those. Maybe find a way to bring that into an anthology if possible. And maybe more essays. As I mentioned earlier, I do want to write a few essays about some of the very remarkable women, contemporary women, walking the spiritual journey in their own very idiosyncratic ways. So maybe that will be next.
Thank you so much, Arun. It's really, as always, been a pleasure to talk to you in a public forum, but with all the energy and warmth that characterizes all our conversations in private. And I'm glad we were able to share this with people who love your work. And I'm going to pass this back to Peter now, who will doubtless have a vote of thanks and housekeeping and other things. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ranjit. Thank you. It made all the difference, really, having someone, having you at the other end. It made all the difference to the tenor, the texture of this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Harish, could you turn my video back on, please?
I think Arundhathi have to make Peter a co-host. can you please just click on his name? It will show more and just make him co-host.
Make him co-host? I
Yes.
just do it. I have to click on
Yes,
it.
Peter.
Just next to my name, just do it, allow video.
Just move the mouse over his name, Peter Griffin,
So
and you'll see a more.
let's not worry about that. It doesn't matter that you can't see my face. What is important is that I have the happy duty of representing the audience to our panel and representing Prakriti to the audience. So first, thank you to all of you who've attended. It's been wonderful. Glad that you've made the time. We have gone over time and you've stayed right through it, and thank you for that. Left to me, I would just let this conversation go on for hours because it's just so lovely to sit and listen to people talk poetry with engagement, with love, with affection, with an understanding of each other. And for that, thank you, Arundhathi and Ranjit. It was a pleasure. And as Arundhathi said, it's such an intimate experience to have you talking here. It was like sitting in a cafe with you guys back in the days when I didn't know you. So I feel that, yeah, this is my way of making up for not knowing you fellows in the poetry circle days and stuff like that, even though we're, the same age, give or take. Fortunately, I got to know you later in life, and for which I remain grateful. And thank you also, of course, to our host, Prakriti Foundation, who made this festival possible. Meera, who's been running this festival practically from a hospital bed, and Harish, who's been taking up the slack, Ranveer, who's the powerhouse, making everything going. Thank you, folks, for keeping this festival going, bringing it online, and enabling so many poets to reach out to audiences in different ways. Thank you, Madras University, for being an associate in presenting this. It's we will be back next week. Prakriti is starting a mini series within Poetry with Prakriti, which is readings in memory of poets who have appeared in Poetry with Prakriti, but are no longer on this planet with us. It is my particular pleasure that next week's reading will be in honor of Margaret Mascarenhas. Margaret was my first boss, a very dear friend. And there's a link between today and next week. I visited Margaret when she was dying. And while I was there, I read poetry to her. And I read Arundhathi's poems to her. I read the poems of the Chrome and that entire series. And she smiled, she laughed at some points, she nodded, and then she slowly drifted into a quiet, very restful sleep. So for that as well, thank you, Arundhathi, for giving my friend solace at a time when she was letting go of the world. Next week, a reading in honor of poetry in honor of Margaret Mascarenhas at Poetry with Prakriti. There will be a number of friends of Margaret, each reading from her work. We hope to see you back then. So thank you once again, Ranjit, for that. Steering this lovely conversation. Thank you, Prakriti. And thank you, Arundhathi Subramaniam. It was beautiful.
Thank you so much.